Taxes, taxes, taxes. They affect everything we buy and everything we do. And today we have the state's top expert on Hawaii taxes, Lowell Kalapa, president of the Tax Foundation of Hawaii. Thanks for joining us.
Well, I'm glad to be here.
You have been following down at the state capitol. You're down there all the time listening to the legislators and what they're proposing in terms of tax increases. What are the big issues this legislative session?
Well, I think the big issue is the lack of tax increases. You know, for the first time in a number of years now, the legislature has hit a rock wall, if you will. They've run out of taxes to increase, and so they've resorted to other ways to raise money, and that's called the user fee. And so there are a lot of bills this year that are focused on user fees, increasing them or adding new ones as a way to raise money. This happened way back in the mid-1990s under former Governor Ben Cayetano, when Department of Commerce and Consumer Affairs raised all the business registration fees to the extent that they were generating surpluses each year. So here comes another wave of fees, and this time largely from the Department of Health. And so among them, increases in the marriage license to over $100, another dollar on your car registration fee to fund the disabled parking program. So there's a plethora of ways that legislators have found to raise additional funds without really raising taxes. After all, for the last couple of years, they raised the income tax. They cut off itemized deductions. You can't deduct your state taxes if you're over a certain income. They've raised the TAT, or hotel room tax, by 2 percentage points. And they've raised the fuel tax by a penny. So they've pretty much stretched people thin, and people are getting very unhappy, and they're very restless because the amount that's going for taxes has just grown over the last few years as we've been faced with these looming deficits. So if there's any action, there's lack of action in tax increases, but there are subtle ways that lawmakers are finding to raise additional funds.
And that's a big debate. Senator Gabbard, for example, is talking about raising the plastic fee. He keeps calling it a fee on the plastic bag, but then others will say, well, it is a tax. So there's a debate on what's a fee, what's a tax, and basically it's coming out of your pocket, and it's more money from you.
And if you have no choice in paying it, it's a tax.
Right.
They say it's for the pleasure or the convenience of having to carry your groceries home in a plastic sack. Mm-hmm. Well, that would be true if, in fact, the money that they're collecting went towards educating the public about recycling their plastic bags or disposing of them. But in the case of the proposal that the Senate heard the other day, the money goes basically towards general fund programs. In that case, the watershed program and the environmental response fund. And the problem we have with it is, if in fact we are successful in discouraging consumers from asking for plastic bags for their groceries or whatnot, there'll be no money coming in. And when no money comes in and they have this additional workforce working on the watershed program or the environmental response fund, there's no money to be had. What's going to happen? Are they really going to lay off all those employees that they've now hired? Or will those employees and their unions demand that lawmakers raise other taxes so that they can keep their jobs? So that's a real fear that we have, is that we're just growing government way beyond the means of the public to support it.
Now, what is the actual proposal right now for the plastic bags? We've had 5 cents, 10 cents per bag.
The current version of the bill has a 10-cent fee, of which the collections, $800,000 would go into the Department of Health to run the program. Mm-hmm. And the rest of the money then is divided up between the Environmental Response Fund, which I think it's about 20%. The rest of it goes to the watershed program. So in essence, on one hand, the retailers who are dispensing these plastic bags want the fee in the belief that they will change people's habits. But what they aren't seeing is the other half of the bill, which is a money raiser for state government. And this is the scary thing, is that it's been packaged very carefully. So you have, on one hand, the retailers wanting the fee so they don't have to give out paper bags, which they say costs much, much more. And on the other hand, you have the environmentalists who want the money to run the watershed program. So here you have these two diverse groups supporting the bill, both of which are bad for the taxpayer.
You know, it's interesting. I've heard Senator Gabbard, who's the kind of the person spearheading this, wouldn't you say, at least in the Senate. I've heard him speak about plastic bags, and he goes to his, sees plastic bags flying around, and that's when he wants them to not be flying around anymore. So in theory, you could just ban them like other counties have. But one thing that's interesting is every single weekend I go down to Bellows Beach and I pick up trash, and I go to Kailua Beach. I've never seen a plastic bag. I pick up bags and bags and bags in plastic bags of trash, but what's washing up is not plastic bags.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So.
And, we just have to look to the other so-called user fee, the bottle bill, which there's a nickel on every beverage bottle that you purchase. And right now we have millions of dollars, over $30 million of surplus sitting there because the bottles have not been redeemed. So have we changed people's habits, or are we just creating yet another fund? It would be embarrassing certainly for lawmakers to raid the bottle fee because they were so genuine about so-called recycling beverage bottles, so they don't dare touch it or get their hands on it. On the other hand, with this single-use bag fund, it's already been earmarked for purposes other than recycling. So what are we trying to do other than grow the size of government? And that's why several senators agreed when we called it a money grab. It's nothing more than a way to raise additional funds to expand government. And this is something at a time when we as taxpayers and consumers, we're pinching pennies to try to make ends meet because of the tough economic times. This is not a time to put yet more money into state government. I mean, the more money in our economy that is earmarked for government means there's less money in the free market economy to grow the economy. And yet, this is what legislators want to do. They want to jumpstart the economy. And really, the only thing they've done so far that we can see is passage of a huge capital improvements program. And in order to implement that so that it's shovel-ready, they've basically indicted the very system that they've created. And that is all of the regulations that normally go with the processing of a development or a construction project, they want to waive. They want to bypass so they can, fast-track the project to stimulate the economy. And yet, it is those very regulations, Malia, that the private sector struggles with to try to get any kind of development, renovation off the ground. The permitting process here in this state is as onerous as I have ever seen, and it should be characterized as another tax, because the more time it takes to process that permitting process along, it costs us money. Because if people don't understand, unless they've done it, they know that you have, as a developer or as a business, say even building out office space, you borrow the money so you can do the improvements. As soon as you got that project going, or in the sense of processing it for permits, you've already taken out the financing. And so every day of delay is yet more interest that you're paying, and you haven't even built the project.
No income, but lots of interest and lots of expenditures.
A lot of financing costs, a lot of experts that are trying to meet the requirements of the regulations that the permitting process requires. And yet, this legislature says, well, you know what? We want to get the shovel in the ground immediately, so we'll just kind of ignore all of those regulations that we've established. So the very protections that they think are so important and essential, they're willing to bypass, but they're not willing to recognize, that's the very yoke that hangs around the neck of businesses. And just the other day, Darcy, the construction company.
Darcy Construction, right.
They're going out of business, and what did they cite? The cost of regulation and taxes. Here's a company that had numerous employees, been in business for 40 years, and they finally threw in the dish towel and said, can't do it. We're going to quit, and we're going to lay off all these people as a result of government regulations and taxes.
Well, it's interesting because it is very hypocritical, I'd say, if the legislature knows that they can't build the projects or get them off the ground with their own regulations, and yet they expect the businesses to do it. So it is interesting. It's an interesting dynamic now, because you have the Republicans are against it in the House and Senate, and the Democrats are for it, for skipping the environmental processes that they've set up. And just the other day, we had a rally at the Capitol. The environmental groups came together with a bunch of different people from the community saying, you know, this is not right. So if you're going to have these protections there, they should stay there for everyone.
Either that or you should streamline
or
it.
reform the whole thing,
Reform
right?
the whole system.
And the groups were saying, we know it needs to be reformed, but this isn't the way to do it. Just throw it all out.
Yeah, and you know, I think for a lot of your viewers who perhaps have never undertaken a project, one of the things that we talked about in the past is that if an architect who is licensed under the state signs off on plans saying that everything that's in the plans of the owner or developer or whatever meets the regulations, the building code and so on, then why do you need to have a public employee go over the plans for another 5 to 6, maybe 7, maybe even longer than 7 or 8 weeks? Why isn't the liability, because you know the public employee is saying, well, I've got a liability. If there's a mistake, then I'm going to be blamed for it. Why isn't the liability placed on the licensed professional? And that would expedite things much quicker. And you know, we've talked about it for years and nothing has happened. So there are ways to meet the regulatory standards, that is to ensure health and safety as well as protecting the environment without the double and triple reviews by public sector.
Well, so what are some of the other issues that are coming up? I mean, we always see, you know, cigarette taxes, liquor taxes, and so on. That it's like a punishment situation whenever the legislature gets together. It's like, how bad are you based on what your sins are? And now plastic bags are kind of put in there. We've had soda tax, you know, debated, and we even had Governor Abercrombie talk about an ice cream tax when I was at one of the conferences, press conferences. But you know, it's always kind of like the legislators are kind of picking on people's private habits and taxing them. Is that, have you seen that this year, or is that kind of?
Well, you know, the soda tax, as you said, was floating around again, and I can constantly point out it's not just soda that contributes to the childhood obesity problem. There are a number of other things. Even the First Lady has pointed out that kids are very sedentary. You know, they don't get up, they don't exercise like we did when we were smaller. So she's got this, you know, get up and go program to get kids to exercise, to get out and play and run in the fields. And one way to address childhood obesity. The other thing I think is childhood obesity goes far beyond just soda.
Right.
And we have to understand why kids are obese for what reasons. So for a lot of people, they go, oh, see, you know, there they go. The poorer families don't know good nutrition and they feed their kids junk food. Well, that may be part of the reason. But the other part of the reason that people have never thought about is when kids see food and it's available to them, they gorge themselves. Not because it's free food, it's because of the fear that they may not get dinner when they go home tonight because their family is so so poor. You know, I've seen kids stuff food off a buffet table in their pockets because they think they may not have dinner tonight and this will hold them over. So, you know, it's not just soda, you know, it's not just being sedentary. You know, the other thing is, have we looked at this generation? I hate to mock it, but the whole internet generation, the whole iPod generation has contributed to the fact that kids no longer get out and play. They're there with their iPods or their Blackberries, and they're sitting in a corner, not only not exercising, but not gaining the social skills that they need to interact. So there are a variety of reasons that have changed as a result of societal changes as well as demographic changes. So to blame just one product, be it cigarettes, you know, or in this case sodas, I think is very narrow-minded, and it really will not address the problem.
And I think a lot of it is, yes, they tax that product, but then a lot of times they use the money for other things. Like they'll say it might be for child obesity, but then the money will go to the general fund, and then that'll end up somewhere else. And just like cigarettes, the money from the tobacco settlement didn't just go to... Well,
where you have a unrelated beneficiary. So in the case of cigarettes, as you point out, I don't know if people realize it. On one hand, we have to raise the cigarette tax because a higher price will discourage, you know, especially youth from starting to smoke or get people to stop smoking. Well, if the goal is to stop smoking, then don't rely on the revenues of that particular tax to fund such programs or projects as the Cancer Research Center. So
because the government, in a sense, benefits with more people smoking.
with more people smoking
And more people using plastic
specific,
bags.
and specific programs.
Right.
So the community health center programs, the Cancer Research Center are all dependent on the cigarette tax. So should we, or if you're an advocate of the Cancer Research Center, tell everybody you know that smokes, please smoke some more because we need your funding.
Right.
And that's really what it is. And you sit there, wait a minute,
Doesn't make sense.
that doesn't make any sense. A little bit hypocritical.
Right.
Same thing with the bag fee, you know.
Right.
Don't use bags, but we're going to use it for the money that we get from those bags, we're going to use it for the watersheds. It doesn't make any sense.
So the more
at all.
bags you use, the more it helps the watershed, right?
Exactly.
I know.
So, you know, with all of those bills going back and forth, you have to shake your head and say, this doesn't make any sense. You know, there should be some sort of relationship that the more you do something, the more benefit that the user gets. And this is just the opposite in the case of both the proposals for the soda tax, the proposals for the bags, single-use bags, proposals for the cigarette tax. So, yeah, it's kind of ironic.
It is. Well, you know, it's interesting because I like a lot of the legislators personally that I've got to know personally over the many years covering them, and I like them. I think they have a lot of common sense, maybe one-on-one, but something happens when they all get together. Common sense seems to go out the window.
Well, I think it's because they pursue their number one goal, and that is the day after they're elected, their number one goal is to get reelected. And so therefore they pander to their constituents without taking well thought out, well-researched stands. I mean, we just looked at the alternate energy tax credit, and you know, it seems that the alternate energy tax credit was passed solely out of emotion, that we're going to get people off of the electrical grid, we're going to get people to use sun power, wind power, and so on, and we're going to give them an incentive with tax credits. Well, what we come to learn is because they were also afraid of losing a lot of money, they imposed caps. So it was 35% of your cost of improvement with the alternate energy device, but you can only do it up to a certain dollar amount. And what has happened is that those dollar amounts basically are inefficient when it comes to the amount of energy you need to generate in order to really get off the grid. So in the case of commercial, there are caps where they're totally irrelevant because a commercial property may need maybe 3 times or 4 times the amount of the cap in order to be what we call net zero, completely off the grid. But they get penalized because if they do add more, 1, they won't get any credit. 2, if they don't add any more because that's all they can afford with the credit, they end up paying a much higher standby fee from the local electric company. So, you know, nobody took the time, I think, to research and find out if we pass a credit, you know, and they only can put in so much, they really don't get off the grid, and the local electric company imposes a flat rate on them that turns out that they're paying more per kilowatt hour for the kilowatts they actually consume. And that's what's happened to a lot of commercial businesses.
So what are some of the other, you know, I've heard about the film credits, again, they're back.
They're back.
And I talked to Ryan Kavanagh of Relativity Media about that. He's pushing for those film credits, and of course his side is that they're going to help establish an industry here, and that we don't have any framework and training and so on. But your view is different, that film credits don't work. Is that true?
And the film credits, I mean, the general tome of research that's been done by people who study tax policy is that the film credits are a waste of money, you know, because they don't create permanent industries. They come in, they do their thing, they get their subsidy, they get their tax credit, and they leave. You know, I think, you know, that's not to say that I don't admire and enjoy some of the films that have benefited. The Descendants, everybody's you know, gaga over the Descendants, but you also have to admit that when you watch that film, you're mesmerized not so much by the script or the acting as much as you are by the scenery.
It's fantastic scenery.
And
the music.
Excellent job. And
right,
the music.
Right.
And I think that we sell ourselves short when we have to hand out tax credits when our environment is so accommodating and so nurturing to that kind of production. The real question is, what do the people of Hawaii get out of it, other than, yes, some temporary jobs, and yes, it may promote Hawaii as a place to visit, but does it really create a permanent industry? And that's why the versions of the film credit bill right now are so focused on the amount of payroll that is going to local residents, because up until now, a lot of the post-production and pre-production has not been done in Hawaii, so they don't hire Hawaii residents. And so now the proposal that's before the legislature will give you added credit amount if so much of your payroll is you've hired local residents. So, we're beginning to realize some of the mistakes we made. Now, the people who have been before the legislature to advocate for these are people who are financially benefiting, because they're the lawyers and they're the accountants who are putting together these deals. Has it really benefited the general public, and what kind of contribution has the industry made back to Hawaii? And I think when you look at it, average Joe taxpayer, nothing to do with the industry, what's the return on investment? And it'd be different if we all filed our Hawaii income tax returns, and instead of getting nothing back, maybe we get a copy of the DVD of The Descendants. It'd be nice. At least you get something back.
Right.
In this case, we are paying, you and I, are paying so that these film companies or producers can come to Hawaii. So when you fill out your tax return and send in your check this April, just be glad that you're paying for these tax credits.
Right, exactly. Now, some of the city is also a big issue right now, and you just released a report, a study. Can you tell us about that?
I just finished chairing a committee or a commission that took a look at the real property tax with respect to the policy embodied by the exemptions that are granted under the real property tax. And basically, we looked at the tax with an eye towards fairness and equity, and really whether or not the exemptions or the provisions for exemptions accomplish the goal that they set out to do. And in many cases, we found that a lot of the exemptions are totally irrelevant, bear no real benefit for the public as a whole, or come at the expense of everybody else. And I think that's what people need to understand when they look at a report to say they're recommending either controversial as it may be, having nonprofits pay something. In a sense, nonprofits believe they should be exempt because they're exempt from state and federal income taxes, and in some cases, they don't pay general excise taxes on some of the income they receive. But what they forget is that the real property tax is really a tax for city services. And we all benefit, because of health and safety reasons, from city services. And to absolve any one entity from paying any of the costs of those city services just creates the illusion that we can have more for nothing. And so when I look at, say, a church, there was one out in Naea that burned. They called the fire department. The fire department is paid by the real property tax. Was it fair that all of us pitch in to pay for that call by the fire department, or should the church have some role in paying for it? The other thing is the accountability. If you don't pay for something, you expect it for nothing. And that should not be the case. We need to realize that our resources are finite, that in fact somebody ends up paying when somebody doesn't pay. So in the case of the historical homes exemption, which really sparked all of this discussion, is somebody owns a very old home that really reflects the heritage of our community, has nothing to do with their inability or ability to pay their fair share of the cost of county services. And all we're saying is they should have a hand in paying for some of the city services they avail themselves. It's not like they don't enjoy police protection from not being burglarized, or fire protection to protect them from their house burning down. So what we're saying is, have a hand in paying for it. Right now, all of those total exemptions, they pay a minimum of $300 a year. Well, a house right next door that may not be historical is maybe paying several $1,000s a year. So all we're saying is, pay something more than the minimum $300 and appreciate what the county has given you as far as services are concerned.
So what are some of the other, aspects of the report you have? Did you talk about senior citizens or business taxes, or what are some of the other things that have come out?
I think the other controversial one is that we're recommending getting rid of the home exemption, which probably won't happen because of political reasons.
What's the home exemption?
The home exemption is granted to anybody who owns their own shelter. So as a homeowner, you get $80,000 basic off your valuation before they start imposing the real property tax rate. If you're a senior, you get multiples of the $80,000, so you get more of your property exempted. And as I pointed out, age and disability are not indicators of your ability or inability to pay. You could have a senior who is sitting on a portfolio of stocks and has all kinds of investments, getting the multiple home exemption, versus the young couple just starting out in one of those zero lot lines out in Eva Beach or someplace like that, getting the minimum home exemption. What is even worse is that just under half of our residents here on Oahu rent their homes, and they get no break. Their landlord gets no special exemption because he's renting to a person who is renting his apartment or home or whatever. And so renters bear the full brunt of the real property tax burden. So there's inequity there. And what we have said is there is already a mechanism here in the city and county, as well as in the other counties, that looks at your income and says, this property tax bill is too large for the kind of income you have, and we're willing to forgive it. And so a senior who is living on limited income would get tax relief. A young couple that's just starting out, both of them working 2 jobs, they would get tax relief if the property tax bill exceeds a certain percentage of their income.
Can you believe we're already out of time? So I want to tell people to look at your website with the Tax Foundation of Hawaii, and thank you for being a voice of reason and sanity at our legislature and our council. I hope you'll come on the show again.
Thanks for having me.
This has been News Behind the News. Thank you for joining us. Aloha.